Is the Pope the vicar of Christ or the Antichrist? Today we're going to look at why Catholics believe that the Pope has authority, spiritual authority over every man, woman, and child on earth. I'm going to go through a biblical argument from the Old and New Testaments. I'm going to go through examples of Peter exercising this authority in the New Testament, and I'm going to go over what a few of the church fathers taught about the papacy. By the end of this video, you may not accept that the Pope is who he claims to be, but you will know why Catholics think that. That's my goal. Even though you may not agree with the papacy, you'll at least understand why Catholics believe that the Pope is who he claims to be. The first thing I want to hit on is from the New Testament. And the fact of the matter is that there are men who have spiritual authority over other men. I'm surprised how often I get the objection that it's just me and Jesus, and there needs to be nothing in between us, and there's no hierarchy set up, but it's me and Jesus. Everything else doesn't matter. There's an element of truth to that, but in the New Testament, you see that there are men with spiritual authority over other men. Hebrews 13:17. St. Paul says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as men who will have to give an account." The leaders that St. Paul is talking about are spiritual leaders. If you read it in context, these are the leaders who are keeping watch over your souls. These are people with spiritual authority over you. Authority comes from God, all of it. That's what St. Paul says in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. He says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." What is going on here? We see that God appoints men to share in his authority. God gives men authority over other men. Spiritual authority, as we can tell from the book of Hebrews, and temporal authority. Proverbs chapter 8, God says, "By me kings reign." So God, who is the ultimate authority and the source of all authority, gives a share of his authority to men. And that's true spiritually and temporally. There are spiritual leaders and there are political leaders, such as kings. That's the first point. God is not the type of authority who keeps all the authority for himself so that it's just me and God and nobody else can judge me. Nobody else. Nobody can set laws for me. It's just me and God, and nobody else can do anything in that relationship. It's not the way it works. God gives authority to parents over their children. God gives authority to governments over those people who they govern. God gives authority to priests over their parishioners. There is no authority except from God, and God gives the authority to whoever he sees fit. That's the first point. There are certainly spiritual authorities in this world. Second point, I want to start taking a look at the Old Testament Davidic kingdom. The reason for that is that the Old Testament foreshadows the New. St. Paul makes this really clear in Romans chapter 5. He talks about the old Adam and the new Adam. What are some inferences that we can draw from this comparison between the original Adam and Christ, the new Adam? Adam was the firstborn son of God. Jesus is the firstborn son of God. Adam was tempted from a tree. Jesus was tempted from a tree, the cross. Adam was tempted in a garden. Jesus was tempted in a garden. Through Adam's sin, all men fell and incurred death. Through Jesus' obedience, all men are justified and have life. So we see that Adam is a type, a foreshadowing of Christ. And we can learn a lot about Jesus by studying Adam. In the same way, we can learn a lot about Christ's kingdom by studying David's kingdom. So what do we have in David's kingdom? In the Davidic kingdom, we see that we have 12 ministers. In the Davidic kingdom, there are 12 ministers who share in the authority of the king. We can see that in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 19, there are 12 ministers. 12 ministers who reign with David while he's on the throne. And of those 12 ministers, there is one prime minister. There is one minister who's elevated above the other 11 who has authority over them. In 1 Chronicles 11:6, Joab and his successors are named as the chief ministers or the prime ministers. They have authority over the other 11. We see that, and clearly, Jesus has this in mind when he appoints his 12 apostles, and he gives one apostle the prime ministership, Peter. Jesus says that, he says to the apostles, "You will sit on 12 thrones with me, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." 12 thrones for his 12 ministers. And one minister, Peter, is elevated above the other 12, and we'll get into that more in just a second. But for now, I want to turn from the Davidic kingdom to a prophecy about the new kingdom, the kingdom of Christ. In Daniel chapter 2, we have the famous dream of the king. Nobody can interpret nobody can interpret the dream. So the king calls in Daniel, and Daniel interprets this dream. In the dream, we have a statue. The statue has 4 layers. The head is of gold, the chest is silver, the legs are bronze, and the feet are iron and clay. Daniel interprets this prophecy and says that the head corresponds to the Babylonian kingdom, the chest to the Persian kingdom, the legs to the Greek kingdom, and the feet to the Roman kingdom. These 4 layers of the statue correspond to the 4 kingdoms that rule over the Jews. How is this statue destroyed? The statue is destroyed because there is a rock that is hewn from heaven, taken out from heaven, and thrown at the statue. This rock then lands on the statue, crushes it, lands right where the feet are. It lands right on top of that Roman kingdom. After it lands on that Roman kingdom, the feet, it grows into a mountain that covers the whole world. What just happened in this kingdom? In this kingdom, there's a rock, right? Keep in mind that the Latin word for rock is Petros. There's a Peter, a rock, hewn from heaven, cut from heaven, thrown down, lands on this statue that represents the 4 kingdoms, right where the feet are, right where the Roman kingdom is. And then it grows into a mountain that covers the whole world. Protestants, give me a little bit of leeway here, right? You may not accept the Pope. You may not accept that there's a Roman Catholic Church. Fair enough. But do you see why I think there is? You may say, oh, the word for rock is different. Fair enough. You may say that Christ is the rock. Okay, fair enough. But you can see how even if I'm misled, I'm honestly misled by the Old Testament and by this prophecy of Daniel. I see a rock, a Peter, taken from heaven, thrown at the Roman kingdom. It crushes the Roman kingdom and grows into a mountain that covers the whole world. What happened historically? Christ founded his church on Peter. Peter goes to Rome and is martyred. And then the Roman Catholic Church grows and covers the whole world. I see right here an exact fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel. And this kingdom, whatever kingdom it may be, this kingdom that covers the whole world, that's founded in Rome, the rock that lands in Rome, that kingdom, it has to last forever because that's what the prophecy says. I see here a fulfillment of the Roman Catholic Church. There's more that we could say from the Old Testament, but for now, let's move on and talk a little bit about what Jesus says in the New Testament. Matthew 16, verses 13 to 20, give us the foundation of the papacy. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus says to Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church." There's a few different interpretations of that in the fathers. Some fathers see it as Christ establishing Peter as the head of the apostles and as the foundation of the church. Some fathers see it as Christ saying, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." So Christ is calling himself the rock. And then some see the rock as being Peter's confession of faith and Peter's faith, but not Peter's person. When we're interpreting the scriptures, it's important to keep in mind there can be multiple correct interpretations, but never two interpretations that contradict one another. All three of these interpretations are found in the fathers, and I don't think that they contradict one another at all. So if you want to hold that Jesus says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church," that doesn't contradict the interpretation of Jesus saying, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," meaning Peter's person. The two can work together and harmonize. They don't have to be contradictory. So you can have multiple correct interpretations of Scripture so long as they do not contradict. We can see this in the Old Testament too. In the Old Testament, Noah's Ark is a sign of baptism in the New Testament. St. Peter talks about this in his epistles. Noah's Ark is a type or a foreshadowing of the church. In order to be saved, you must be on the ark. In order to be saved in the New Testament, you must be in the church. And the waters of the flood come and they wash away all that is evil. Just as baptism enters you into the church and washes away from you all of your sins and all of your past life. So if you want to interpret Genesis chapter 11, I believe, whenever it talks about the flood, and you want to interpret it as literally Noah built an ark, and his family and he, 8 people, survived on that ark, and every other living thing on the face of the earth died. You want to interpret it literally, that's fine. That's a correct interpretation. But if you want to interpret it spiritually and say that it's a foreshadowing or a type of baptism, even though that's a different interpretation, the two don't contradict. So it's possible that they can both be correct. So that's what I'm seeing in Matthew 16, is even though the fathers interpret the passage differently, if we can try to harmonize the fathers and we can try to bring all of their wisdom together, there's no reason that one interpretation must exclude the others. So Matthew 16, regardless of your interpretation, you see Jesus says to Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." So Christ builds his church on Peter, the rock. He says, "I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Even regardless of what interpretation of Matthew 16 you take, you have to recognize here that Peter is being elevated into that prime minister spot that we talked about. And here is irrefutable biblical proof. Isaiah chapter 22. Pay close attention. In Isaiah chapter 22, what happens is there's a prime minister. His name is Shebna. Shebna's not doing a good job. Shebna is a bad guy. So God says to Shebna that he's going to remove him from his office. And he's going to elevate Eliakim to that office of prime minister. Shebna's getting kicked out. Eliakim's getting elevated. Look it up. Isaiah chapter 22, around verse 22. God says to Shebna, he's going to kick him out. And then he says to Eliakim, or about Eliakim, "I will elevate him to your spot. Whatsoever he opens shall be opened. Whatsoever he shuts shall be shut. I will give him the key of authority." So what do we see? Peter is being elevated to the prime minister spot. Jesus says, "Whatsoever you bind is bound. Whatsoever you loose is loosed. I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." Eliakim, in the Old Testament, is being raised to that spot of prime minister. And whatever he opens is opened. Whatever he shuts is shut. And he's given the key. Jesus knows the entire Old Testament, has it memorized, front to back. And he knows that prophecy from Isaiah chapter 22. And he's referencing it when he elevates Peter to prime minister. Just as Eliakim was elevated to prime minister and another person was kicked out, now Peter's elevated to prime minister and the Jewish authorities are kicked out. Jesus is very clearly making an allusion to Isaiah chapter 22. By the way, I'll give you a document that has all of these verses on it at the end of this. You can go through, look at them yourselves, draw your own interpretation. Like I said, my goal for this video is not to convince you about the papacy. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to show you that it's not unreasonable, not heretical, and not crazy for Catholics to believe that there is an office called the papacy. That's it. My goal is quite a low bar, to be honest. Let's continue here. Let's keep going. On to the better stuff here. We got some really good stuff coming for the end of this video that's going to be concrete examples of Peter exercising this authority. But first, I want to take a look at Luke 22. In Luke chapter 22, Jesus says to Peter, Satan has demanded to have you, second person plural, meaning y'all, all of you. Satan has demanded to have all of you that he may sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, in the singular, second person singular, you, Peter, that after you have turned, your faith may not fail, you may strengthen your brethren. What's going on there? Luke 22. Jesus gives to the apostles a kingdom. Then he says, Satan has demanded to have all of you, that he may sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, Peter, second person singular, that after you have turned, your faith may not fail, and you may strengthen your brethren. Satan wanted all the apostles. Jesus prays for one apostle, the prime minister, Peter, and says, I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail, and that you may strengthen your brethren. John doesn't get that charge. Not James, not Matthew. Nope. Only Peter is told to strengthen the brethren. Christ prays only for Peter that he may strengthen the brethren. Only Peter. Very important. Next, I want to take a look at John chapter 21. This is the famous feed my sheep, feed my lambs, feed my sheep passage in John chapter 21. There's one shepherd, one good shepherd, Christ. However, Christ gives some of that shepherdhood to his apostles. Just as all authority comes from God, and God is the only authority, essentially, other people participate in that authority. Just as there is one God alone, other people get to participate in that divinity. And we see that in John chapter 10, verse 34. Jesus quotes a passage from the Old Testament. He says, You are gods, sons of the Most High, every one of you. Why does Jesus say to the people around him, You are gods? Isn't there only one God? Yes, there's only one God, essentially. One, only one. That's it. However, that God allows men to be partakers or participators in his divine nature. We see this in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4. We are made partakers in the divine nature. You name a thing according to its nature. You call a cat because it has cat nature, and you call a man because he has human nature. You call a God because he has the divine nature. Only God, Father, Son, and Spirit, Blessed Trinity, only God has the divine nature essentially. But God gives us a share in that nature. In the same way, if you walk into a room with a fireplace and there's a fire going, only the fire is hot. However, if you put a pot of water on the fire, that water can become hot by participation. It can share in the heat of the fire. So we see here that there's one good shepherd. However, in John chapter 21, Jesus gives a share of that shepherdhood to Peter. And he makes Peter the head shepherd on earth. Only Peter is given the charge to strengthen his brethren. Only Peter is told, feed my sheep. And there's no qualifications. He doesn't say feed some of my sheep, feed most of my sheep. He says feed my sheep. John is one of the sheep of the Lord. Andrew is one of the sheep of the Lord. Paul is one of the sheep of the Lord. Peter is given a universal charge to feed all of the sheep, all of them. So Peter here is elevated to that role of head shepherd. the head pastor of all souls on the planet. So let's see, when does Peter actually use this authority? What do we see in the New Testament? Does Peter ever have an authoritative say among the apostles? Yes, in at least 2 instances. Acts chapter 1, verses 15 to 26, Peter is the one who decides we need to appoint a successor to Judas. That's where Matthias is elected, and he becomes the 13th apostle, so to speak. He fills Judas's office. Acts chapter 15, this is a big one. Acts chapter 15. There's a debate. Do Christians need to obey the Jewish food laws? Do Christians need to be circumcised? Yes or no? Huge question. Think about if you're an adult male and somebody is trying to convert you to Judaism, and they say, oh, by the way, you have to be circumcised and stop eating all these foods. That's not going to make you want to convert, not at all. It's a big question. Jesus himself obeyed the Jewish laws. Jesus never ate pork. Jesus was circumcised. So do we enforce that upon new Christians or not? It's not an easy question. Not at all. We want to do what Jesus did, and Jesus obeyed the Jewish law. So Peter is ultimately the one, after this big debate, there's a lot of arguing and a lot of good points probably being made on both sides. Peter is the one who stands up and says, this is the decision. This is it. Boom, mic drop. And the people fall silent. Afterwards, James summarizes Peter's teaching and puts it in a written form. But Peter's the one who declares the Jewish food law is no longer binding. The Jewish law of circumcision is no longer binding. Peter does that. No one else. Peter. Let's take a look now and see what the early church taught about this. I only want to take a look at maybe 2 quotes, but I'll give you a document, and you can go through this document and look at some of the church fathers' writings about the papacy. It's striking. It's very striking. Some of the objections I get is that we don't see the papacy in the early church fathers. First of all, I think that's false. And if you read this document, I think you'll agree with me. Secondly, is the Roman Church was the epicenter of Christian persecutions. If you're the Pope in Rome, you've got a lot on your plate. You've got some big fish to fry, and maybe you're not as concerned with what's going on in Asia when your own parishioners are being fed to lions. You're in an underground church. Communication is not easy because if your letters get intercepted, people are going to die. So if you're a Roman Pope, if you're a Roman bishop, it's not a surprise that we don't see a ton of popes exercising their authority in other dioceses. We do see it, but perhaps we don't see it as richly as we would if Nero wasn't feeding Christians to lions. You've got a lot on your plate if you're a bishop in Rome. So I don't think it's surprising at all that an underground church has to operate clandestinely, and you don't see this huge flex of Roman authority. Clement of Rome. He is the 3rd pope after Peter. And this 3rd pope in the year 80 AD, 1st century, this is when John the Apostle may still be alive, before the death of the last apostle. Clement of Rome writes a letter to Corinth, and in that letter, he commends them to be obedient to him. Why is Clement of Rome, who, by the way, is mentioned by St. Paul in the New Testament, why is Clement of Rome writing a letter to another diocese telling them to be obedient to him? It's because he's the Pope. It's because he has authority over that diocese, even though he's not in it. I have the quotes here. You can read them yourselves. I'll put those in the description for you, but we're going to move on for the sake of brevity here. This video is getting a little longer than I want it to be. The second point, Ignatius of Antioch. About the year 110, beginning of the 2nd century, he says this: "You," meaning the Church of Rome, "have envied no one, but others you have taught. I desire only that what you have enjoined in your instructions may remain in force." He also says this: "Ignatius, to the church which holds the precedency and the location of the country of the Romans, worthy of God, worthy of honor, worthy of blessing, worthy of praise, worthy of success, worthy of sanctification, and because you hold the precedency in love, named after Christ and named after the Father. Rome holds the precedency in love. Precedency, the first. They are the most authoritative church. See that clearly in St. Ignatius. St. Irenaeus, in his book Against Heresies, he notices how Pope Victor is interfering in affairs in Asia. In Asia, they're celebrating Easter on the calendar date that they thought Easter happened. And in the rest of the church, they celebrate Easter always on a Sunday, which is the practice that the Roman Church has today. So there was this big debate about, do we follow the tradition that we have from St. John the Apostle of always celebrating Easter on the same calendar date, or do we always celebrate Easter on a Sunday? In Asia, they very much want to continue the practice of celebrating Easter on the calendar date that they thought it happened, because that tradition allegedly came from John the Apostle. The rest of the church is celebrating Easter on a Sunday. So the Pope Victor, excommunicates those in Asia who want to celebrate Easter on the same calendar date. St. Irenaeus then steps in and he rebukes Pope Victor. Now, he does not say, Pope Victor, you don't have the authority to excommunicate them. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, Pope Victor, who told you that you could do this? You have no authority to do such. He does not say that. He recognizes the Pope's authority to excommunicate the churches in Asia, and then tells the Pope that he's being too harsh with his authority that he rightfully has, and that he needs to let off and he needs to be more charitable towards them. Irenaeus does not deny that Pope Victor has that authority. He simply thinks that he's abusing the authority that he has from God. He also says in his book Against Heresies, with that church, meaning the Roman Church, because of its superior origin, all the churches must agree. That is, all the faithful in the whole world. And it is in her that the faithful everywhere have maintained the apostolic tradition. Irenaeus, in the year 189 AD-ish, 2nd century, says, with the Roman Church, because of its superior origin, all the churches must agree. That is, all the faithful in the whole world. I'm not making this up, guys. There's a reason that Catholics think that the Pope has authority over everyone, over all the bishops. Because I see it in the Old and New Testaments, and I see it in the Fathers. I see it abundantly clearly in the Fathers. There's more quotes here. I'm going to just read one from St. Cyprian of Carthage. This is from the year about 253 AD. Cyprian of Carthage says this: there is one God and one Christ and one church and one chair founded on Peter by the word of the Lord. It is not possible to set up another altar or for there to be another priesthood besides that one altar and that one priesthood. Whoever has gathered elsewhere is scattering. Cyprian of Carthage, in about the year 250-253 AD, recognizes there's one church and one chair founded by Peter. So what do we have here? To conclude this whole video, what I would like to say is this. As a Catholic, I see Peter as the prime minister, as the fulfillment of what we saw in the Davidic kingdom. In the Davidic kingdom, there's 12 ministers. One is elevated to the role of prime minister. In the New Testament, there are 12 apostles. One is elevated to the role of prime apostle. I see in the New Testament Peter exercising that authority. I see in the church fathers all the other bishops of the entire world showing deference to the Bishop of Rome. That's what I see. So Even if you don't think the papacy is real, even if you think it was devised by the Roman Church centuries later, can you at least see why I think the papacy is real and why I think the Bishop of Rome has authority over all the other bishops and over the universal church? If you agree with me, let me know in the comments. If you disagree, also let me know in the comments.